Every great television show needs a great villain who we can love to hate. From Walter White to The Night's King, television has featured some menacing villains, but I believe none are more treacherous than George Costanza, Jerry Seinfeld's best friend from hit 90s sitcom Seinfeld. George may not appear to be as frightening as some of these other villains, but he repeatedly proves himself to be just as evil as some of the greats. George Costanza is one of the most iconic sitcom characters of all time and should be known as also one of the most iconic villains. George Costanza is a character who time and time again proves himself to be, in his own way, just as evil as many iconic villains we know and love. Seinfeld is one of my favorite television shows of all time. I've watched it many times and believe George truly belongs among the great villains. First, I'll discuss what makes George a great character. Then I'll discuss what makes George a great villain. Then I'll discuss why George is just as evil as other great villains. Ever since Seinfeld began to air in 1989, George Costanza has remained one of the great sitcom characters of all time. George is one of the funniest characters in anything ever. In each episode of Seinfeld, George proves himself to be the funniest character on the show. His neurotic and boisterous behavior creates some of the greatest moments in sitcom history. From lying about being Art Vandelay, the architect, to sleeping with a cleaning woman on his desk because he didn't realize that wasn't allowed, he constantly proves himself to be one of the funniest characters ever. Part of what makes George so funny is the performance given by Jason Alexander. Jason Alexander's performance as George earned him 2 Screen Actors Guild Awards, 4 Golden Globe nominations, and 8 Emmy nominations, and he deserves to have won every single one of them. He transforms himself into the neurotic megalomaniac that is George Costanza. George is also written by and based off of the Seinfeld co-creator Larry David. Larry David is known as one of the funniest writers and people on the planet, and many of George's actions are based directly on things that Larry David actually did. George is not only one of the funniest characters in all of television, he is also one of the most evil. What makes George so funny is exactly what makes him a great villain: his boisterous and ridiculous behavior and actions. At any given time in any given episode, George is always making the worst possible decision, often putting others and even himself in danger because he thinks it will somehow benefit him in some twisted way. Throughout the series, George commits a variety of increasingly evil misdeeds and transgressions. George has pushed children to the ground in order to save himself from a small fire, pretended to be handicapped to get a job, tried to remove an injured man's IV so that he could steal his girlfriend, drugged his boss, and inadvertently killed his fiancée because he made her buy the cheapest possible invitations, which ultimately led to her death. And he later shows no remorse for any of these actions. George once said of himself, "I'm disturbed, I'm depressed, I'm inadequate, I've got it all." George's actions and crimes allow him to be one of the great villains in TV history, I believe. While George's actions are clearly horrible, it may seem like a stretch to compare them to someone like the Night's King from Game of Thrones, but I believe he is just as evil in a different way. What makes George a great villain is he is the type of evil that's attainable. Characters like Walter White and the Night's King are the kind of evil that's larger than life and we could never expect to realistically encounter in our day-to-day lives. The things George does are an amplified version of the sort of things that we see people do on a daily basis, just amplified for comic effect. We all know someone that's like George, and we all hate that person. George also does have a true evilness about him. He never shows any remorse for anything he does to anyone, including indirectly causing the death of his fiancée because he was too cheap to buy non-poisonous wedding invitations. He never shows any care for anyone but himself, and is never given any redeeming qualities. Even Walter White loved his family, not George. George shows nothing but disdain for his family. We never see that George has any reason for any of his horrible actions. He just seems to be a bad person for the sake of being a bad person. In conclusion, first I discussed what makes George Costanza a great character. Then I discussed what makes George a great villain. And finally, I discussed why George is just as evil and just as great as some of the other great villains. George Costanza is a character who time and time again proves himself to be, in his own way, one of the most iconic villains in all of television. George is not only one of the greatest television characters, but one of the greatest villains, and deserves to go down as such. Thank you.